and welcome to Food Literacy for All. We have a great presentation for you today. We have Beginning to End Hunger Lessons from Belo Horizonte, Brazil, with Dr. Jahi Chappell. So we're very excited. As always, we have food literacy led by Margot Finn and Shakira Tyler. And more team members from the course that make this possible: Megan Gross, Naxi Hernandez, myself, Kimmy Vandeweghe, and Sammy Maldonado, and then always Chris Taylor for technology and support. Thank you so much to our sponsors, people who help us put this course on. We have CEWS, we have CEW Plus, so definitely check them out. Also the CEW Plus Francis and Sydney Lewis Visiting Leaders Fund. Also, feel free to engage with us wherever possible. We have Twitter or X, and all classes are filmed and available online. And we'll get to it later, but we will be doing the poll questions on Zoom today instead of iClicker. And then our reading response we have from Zoe W. So we can play that.
This whole semester, we've been discussing various topics regarding food sovereignty, food access, food discrimination, etc. And this week, we're going to be talking a little bit about world hunger and really tangible solutions to ending it. The truth is, world hunger has a tangible solution, but it comes down to issues of power. A great example of how strides toward ending world hunger is a city in Brazil named Belo Horizonte. This community gets access to healthy and cheap food through various initiatives such as ABC Markets, where specific healthy options are only listed for 20 cents a kilo. Something that stood out to me in the video was the mayor's personal connection to this issue. He shared that he struggled with food security when he was younger, and so once he was elected to office, he knew that he had to make a difference in this way. And I think it's such a powerful thing. We've been hearing personal stories all semester regarding food, and this is a way that somebody took their personal experience and made a true difference within the system itself. And I hope that this is something we start to see more and more often as the next generation enters the workforce. He used his power for good, providing many people with healthy and accessible options. This leaves me with questions for our local, statewide, and nationwide government policies and why we aren't seeing these amazing initiatives closer to home, because it is possible.
Thanks so much for that reading response. So today I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Jahi Chappell. Jahi Chappell is a scholar, organizer, son of social workers, and grandson of Michigan farmers. Over the past 20 years, both within the nonprofit sector and academia, Jahi has researched and advocated at international, national, and local levels for participatory, socially just, and ecologically sustainable agri-food systems that center the voices of farmers, laborers, and the communities they serve. He's the author of Beginning to End Hunger, Food and Environment in Belo Horizonte, Brazil and Beyond, and co-author of Agroecology Now, Transformations Towards More Just and Sustainable Food Systems. Currently, Jahi is the director for the Center of Regional Food Systems at Michigan State University. Jahi holds a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering and a PhD in ecology and environmental biology, evolutionary biology, EEB, both from the University of Michigan. I'll turn the time over to you now.
Okay, great. Good evening, everyone. So it's a pleasure to join you all, and thank you for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen. So yeah, great to join you all, and I look forward to this presentation and the Q&A afterwards tonight. So we're going to jump right in with our first poll. From even that reading response, it seems like you all have already covered a lot of the topics that I'm going to cover today. So hopefully it's not too much redundancy. But I want to start with, oh, there we go. So we've got it. So it's going to be through Zoom, not through iClicker today, I'm told. So the average recommended daily caloric intake is 2,300 calories per person per day. How many calories per person per day are actually available on average worldwide? And so we'll give it a couple of, a little less than a minute to answer. Okay. Oh, very interesting. Okay, so we've got about 43% of people said the less than 2,100. And it's almost even between all the other answers. So let's see what the case is. So the answer in terms of how many calories per person per day are available in the world is actually almost 3,000. And the thing is, actually, this is after around 1,200 calories per person per day are lost converting grain and other feed to livestock, and about 1,400 calories are lost to waste. So there's a lot of debate about that number. So actually, how much is produced before waste and livestock is closer to 5,000 calories per person per day. If we look at the other numbers, so the first one is the amount of calories available in the United States, how much we consume or waste per person per day here. C, the answer with that had the most responses, there's actually fewer than 8 of the world's 195 countries have that low caloric availability per day. So the number for so-called low-income countries is then around 2,200 or 2,300. And India in particular, and we'll see why it shows India in a second, has 2,500 calories per person per day available. And this is through production and trade, but this is how much is available in the country, in each country or world territory each day. So we can see pretty immediately from that that while hunger is still with us, it is completely unnecessary. You know, we have 2,900 to 5,000 calories produced per person per day in the world, but we still have 730 million to 2.4 billion people of the world's 8 billion people who lack food security. And that range is for a couple of reasons. The FAO and its reports on food security in the world has started reporting a variety of measures from severe undernourishment. They have a classification of hunger. They take into account how many calories they think people should be expending based on how much labor they undergo. So they have a whole range of estimates depending on which one you're looking at. But there's also other reasons that you see this range in the 2.4 billion, which is how much the FAO estimates in terms of people suffering from moderate or severe food insecurity. But there's other reasons that you have that range. So anthropologist Jason Hickel has argued that global poverty measurements are typically based on a $1 or $2 a day standard. He argues that is vastly insufficient in almost any country to purchase enough food and other supplies to live on. And so if you look at the number of people who actually would count as suffering from poverty with a realistic international wage line, that would be about 2 billion people because poverty is the strongest predictor of hunger. Francis Moore Lappé and Joseph Collins argue that you could look at the number being around 2 billion because if you suffer from hunger and malnutrition as a child, as a baby in particular, that actually affects your development throughout your whole life. And so even if you go on to prosper, you know, you have suffered from hunger and continue to suffer in terms of just things that you might not have suffered from, you know, chronic illnesses or other challenges if you had not suffered from hunger early in life. And so 2 billion people, they estimate, is how many people who have experienced hunger as a child and would go on to still be classified as experiencing hunger. So I came to this work, my undergrad degree, as was mentioned, is in engineering. I came into University of Michigan for grad school, focusing on conservation biology, and I really wanted to solve the problem of how do we conserve biodiversity. And agriculture and food has a major effect on our environment. It's the dominant land use worldwide, uh, occupying around 40% of non-ice covered land or more. And thinking like an engineer, I said, well, okay, well, if we're saying that food production and the costs of it from runoff, from direct land use, you know, the cost of biodiversity from agriculture are high, and so we need to optimize how much we produce, you know, maximize it and minimize the area. That didn't make a lot of sense to me if we're starting from the fact that we have more than enough food. As an engineer, if you have a process that is wasting half of the amount, you don't just say, well, how do we put more in stuff more into the start of the process? You figure out how to fix the process. And so I was really curious where people had maybe made some advances in fighting hunger. And I came across the city of Belo Horizonte. And it really spoke to a lot of the things I was interested in because the whole questions of sustainability, to me, is tied up fundamentally with human rights, basic rights of health and well-being, food, clothing, housing. These rights and their provision to me is what sustainable development would be about, is how do we make sure everyone has access to those. And so I wanted to learn what the lessons were from Belo Horizonte and how we could improve on them to take the next steps towards liberation, human rights, and sustainability for everyone. And Belo Horizonte, this is a view from one of the mountains around Belo Horizonte. Belo Horizonte in Portuguese means beautiful horizon. Of course, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Some people have told me that they don't find this beautiful with all the buildings and the human-made nature, but Belo Horizonte means beautiful horizon in any case. So I want to talk about then what I've learned as I thought about what do we actually do? How do we actually fight hunger? What does it actually mean? How do we change the situations that we see around the world? And one of the most important things to me is actually just coming to grips with the results of over 40 years of research. And at least since 1981, when the economist Amartya Sen uh, published his book, Poverty and Famines, he argued that hunger and starvation are very rarely the result of insufficient food availability. They're usually caused by an inability to access food, with poverty being the primary reason. And so that's why you have 2,900 calories per person per day being available, yet 2.4 billion people who are food insecure. It's not because we have less than 2,100 calories available. Economic historian Cormac O'Grada took a slightly different tact and said that a famine-free world depends on improved governance and peace. It is as simple or as difficult as that. From his study of several centuries of famine, that of course environmental factors, production, droughts all affect hunger, but if we look at the strongest predictors, he argues it is peace and governance that is actually for people to have access to food. And this is not a focus of my research or this talk, but I think I would be remiss to not mention two elements right now that point to this admonition from Ograda. We have, the war in Palestine, where famine is about to be formally reached according to the formal measures of that, and the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food arguing that Israel is deliberately starving Palestinians. And so that is a major contributor to an uptick in hunger, as well as the war in Ukraine, which the FAO estimates has resulted in about 23 million more people who are food insecure than would have happened without the war. And of course, the global pandemic of COVID affected hunger as well. So they found about 120 million more unnourished people than if it had never happened. And I would argue that ties back to governance as well. That was not an inevitable result. In Brazil, for example, they rolled back some of the programs I'm going to talk about, and that's part of why I think COVID hit them so hard. But I think it's really important to acknowledge these, even though these examples are not the focus of my talk. But we do see from both of those, food supply is not the problem, even though we have both of those conflicts. And the war in Ukraine is affecting food supplies worldwide because Ukraine and Russia are both major producers of wheat as well as fertilizers. But we haven't seen a dramatic drop in the amount of food available worldwide. It's more the disruption of the systems that provide food and distribute them. And so we see examples, for example, this finding by economist Lisa Smith and colleagues that around 80% of malnourished children in the 1990s lived in countries with food energy surpluses. You also see, as we saw in the previous poll, in the US, we have vastly more than enough food available for everyone to eat at least calorically sufficient diets. But with over 20 years of data, every single year over the past 20 years, greater than 10% of US households have not been able to consistently afford to feed their families. And again, it's not because of lack of food, and it's in most cases not even a case of not being able to afford food, period, but it is a case of choosing between food and medical care, food and books for your kids, food and gas for your car. And none of those should be trade-offs people are thinking about when we have almost 4,000 calories of food available. And then I mentioned the amount of calories available in India earlier, and this is one of the reasons just India is an important case demonstrating this disconnect between food supply and hunger. India has more than sufficient dietary energy supply, but it has the highest prevalence of underweight children. It's called wasting in the world. And the total number of people hungry in India is comparable to the number of people in all of sub-Saharan Africa suffering from hunger. So I've thrown the term around food security a bit, and we haven't actually stepped back to define it. So let's talk about that for a second. So this has become a very common definition used, developed by the FAO, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, but used by academics, activists worldwide, when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food which meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And actually, that definition itself has expanded around dietary needs, food preferences, active and healthy life. Those are additions since the original definition. Um, and within this, the FAO typically breaks down 4 categories: availability, so sufficient food supply of appropriate quality; access, so adequate resources, economic and physical. So you have roads and you have money, for example, to actually acquire food; utilization, the ability to actually consume and benefit from an adequate diet, and we'll come back to that actually shortly as well. But if you're suffering from severe illness, you might not be able to actually absorb nutrients from your food, so utilization is important. And then stability, consistency, and resiliency of access. So these are the 4 elements that FAO typically uses to define food security. Given my interests, one of the first things that occurred to me is I was curious if it's not just about food production, then where we have seen decreases in hunger, how has that happened? And I looked in Belo Horizonte specifically, which I'll talk about in depth, but looking at a larger scale, what can we find out about how food security has improved? And Lisa Smith, again, I mentioned earlier, and Lawrence Haddad in 2015 published what I consider one of the definitive studies on this. And looking at a period from 1970 to 2010, they found almost 50% drop in prevalence of stunting among children in what I'd like to call the majority world. This is another name for what's been called developing countries, lower income countries, global south or the third world. Bangladeshi artist Shahidul Alam came up with the term majority world, and I prefer that one because it actually strictly is true. When we're talking about those countries, we're talking about the majority of people in the world. So in these countries at hand, they found that around 100 million fewer children suffered from stunting, and this was what they used as a proxy for overall food security because child stunting is one of the numbers that we have better records for across a lot of countries over that time period. So we come to the second poll. What has been the largest contributor to decreased hunger worldwide, at least according to Smith and Haddad, since 1970? And so we will pause for 50 seconds for people to answer that. Oh, very interesting. Okay, so we have about 30% of people said increased food production, 34% said increased access to safe water and sanitation. So those are the top 2 choices. So in this case, the majority does rule. If we look at the results from Smith and Haddad, so about 40%, this is 100 million fewer children. You could think of it roughly as 40 million fewer children suffered from hunger between 1970 and 2010 because of increased access to safe water and sanitation. So that top answer was correct. These are actually in reverse order of size of effect. So increased female secondary school attendance and overall improved gender equality was responsible for about 30 million, let's say, or 28% of the improvement in food security. Increased food production was just under 1/5, and increased dietary diversity was about 15%, though an interesting note is that Smith and Haddad and others have noted that increased dietary diversity probably right now has the strongest impact as we continue to fight hunger. This might be the strongest factor in a lot of places. If we look at the graphic from their article breaking this down, this just restates what we said. I combined a couple of categories. So you have safe water and sanitation together was about 40%. And you have dietary energy supply, so food production, was about 20% of it. So food production, it matters. It's not irrelevant. It is a key element of it, but it is far from the whole pie. And if you read, their whole article, they argue, unlike dietary diversity, they think increased food production will not be one of the strongest levers for improving food security in Asia and Africa in particular. So based on this, we can ask what's missing from the common definition of food security. And these are great questions, which we'll come back to later. Sorry, seeing the chat. Um, what's missing from the common definition are the elements of justice and human rights that have the strongest evidence of efficacy, by which I mean safe access to safe water, sanitation, uh, education, gender equality. These are basic human rights under the UN founding document and later covenants that were signed and ratified by most countries, not the US in one case, but uh, basically we see a synergy here of human rights, that sanitation, safe water, gender equality can actually improve food security as well. But that's missing from the common definition of food security. There's also no explicit consideration of sustainability in that common definition. So when I think about this, then in the book I wrote about Belo Horizonte and in a lot of my teaching, I break down sort of three families of frameworks, what I called tendencies at one point, family of frameworks to food security and hunger analysis. And so I'm going to talk about each of those briefly. The oldest and most familiar uh, could be called productivism, food availability decline, and neoproductivism. We don't need to go into the details of those terms right now, but the important part of that, they share a common worldview focused on how many people we have and how much food is produced as the key questions about hunger or starvation. And in their more nuanced versions, they sometimes say, well, it's not just about food supply. Of course, we have more than enough food, but farmers are and farm laborers are most of the world's hungry. And so if they're able to sell more food, we produce and sell more food, then they'll be less hungry because there'll be less poverty, which also has flaws in that, because that often is not what happens when you produce more food. You don't necessarily actually make more money, ironically. And there's some pretty important critiques of this first framework. One is that the focus on production is problematic and just radically incomplete. We just saw, that is about 20% of the picture. That's not nothing, but if we focus on production, we're missing 80% of the picture, which is, I would say, too much of the picture to be missing. Productivism has also been connected to quite a lot of human and environmental tragedy. We've seen countries have their trade wiped out from competition from other countries that have been producing quite a lot of food. We've seen food dumping. The United States has variously engaged in that throughout its history of dumping our surplus in other countries, which crashes their markets and their farmers aren't able to make a living. We also see from our intensive production, we see the use of pesticides, synthetic pesticides, fertilizers, runoff, health effects, cancer. There's a lot of different effects from the way we choose to produce food to human health as well as environmental health. And so just focusing on producing more is connected to too much tragedy to really just let it go unchallenged, a lot of us would say. Nevertheless, it is actually the dominant and, of course, most intuitive way to think about it. People often, including people who should know better, talk about needing to make more food to feed the current or future population when producing more food is really not necessary in the vast majority of cases. So moving on to the second framework family. And so these are actually kind of in chronological order in terms of when they've become more dominant in the academic analysis and literature. So moving on from productivism and ideas that go back to at least Thomas Malthus, if not before, in England. Amartya Sen and others have talked about entitlements and food security. LePay and Collins have talked about hunger and thinking about hunger more expansively in terms of how it affects people throughout their life. And so this framework has a lot of important added nuances. So Hunger, of course, you could approach hunger in a way that just reiterates the first framework that, we have too many people, not enough food, and that's why people are hungry. But there are analyses that, like LePay and Collins, that really could extend beyond that simple understanding of hunger and understand it to cover all who've been affected by it, even into adulthood. Hunger also can be analyzed as structural violence, that is, uh, violence against people, violence that is depriving people of food, of nourishment, of life, of quality of life and life itself, that is a result of sometimes explicit violence, but also structural violence, which means it's baked into the institutions that the choices we make might perpetuate hunger somewhere else. The choices of our government might perpetuate it, even if none of us have sat down and said we want a choice that's going to hurt other people. But that is the result of the systems that we have, and the result of our unwillingness, inability, or just lack of success so far in changing the larger structure sufficiently so that this is not happening. So hunger can go from sort of being too simplistic to actually capturing quite a lot of interesting dynamics. The entitlement approach, relatedly, but a slightly different approach. Um, Entitlement comes from Amartya Sen's work, and he argued that it's not production that is the main factor. It is whether or not people have the appropriate entitlements to get access to food. And he named at least four kinds of entitlement, which is you're entitled to what you produce yourself. So that's one way that you can fight hunger if you can produce your own food. You can trade for needed items. You can work in exchange for pay that you then use to buy items, or work in exchange for items directly, or transfers in terms of money or goods from other family members or the government. And so he said these are really the four ways that you can get access to commodity bundles that you need, like food. And so this starts to get a little bit more into what are the policies, what are the power dynamics? I think the reading response mentioned power. You start getting edging into that question here. And then food security, which, as we've gone through, is, I would say, incomplete, but it does add quite a few important nuances. It's not just how many people and how much food do we have. But as I said earlier, uh, it's still missing two important elements around human rights and around sustainability. And in fact, those two have recently been recommended to be added to the definition of food security. The FAO has acknowledged that recommendation, but not yet adopted it. But so the lack of food security typical definitions to encompass agency and sustainability is the reason that there is another framework, other frameworks. For example, one that's called the 5 A's of food security, which expands on that traditional approach to include agency. And we'll come back to the 5 A's. But so the last tendency I look at as being food justice and food sovereignty. And so defining these quickly, together, they both take power, justice, and distribution as key questions from the start. It's not something you have to add on with entitlements. There isn't question inherently in there, power inherently in there, or justice. It just says these are the entitlements you can have. So food sovereignty and food justice say, well, we have to take power as a key question from the start. Um, if we look at food justice specifically, it could be defined as a movement demanding agri-food systems provide dignified and equitable access to safe, sufficient, and healthy food for all, rooting that demand in the recognition that people have been denied violently, structurally, institutionally, denied justice. And so that has to be addressed, and those power differences faced head on. Historically, food justice has also often been tied to other justice movements, intersectional justice, racial justice, civil rights, and so seeking to address the legacy, and environmental justice is one of the key predecessors, seeking to address the legacy of structural discrimination along race, gender, class, and other lines. It looks at the food system as another side of discrimination, and so not its origin, similar to environmental justice, that the problems with the environment, with environmental justice, of differential exposure or burdens, does not come from the environment itself, but from the choices that we've made and the discrimination that exists. And there's critiques of food justice sometimes that the focus can be in just, okay, we need to have more businesses owned by our people, by our communities. And there's a critique that sometimes that really seeks or works within the current unequal power relationships rather than challenging them, that rather than just having more businesses owned by certain communities, we need to change the questions of how we look at ownership in business itself. And of course, there's a lot of nuances and people who bridge different approaches to this, but that is one possible critique that some have noted of some approaches to food justice. Then looking at food sovereignty, I would define this as a social movement that urges reconsideration of the political and economic relationships governing food and agriculture, but actually beyond that as well. That it demands democratic control and participation in the means of production, in our governance, in order to build sustainable agri-food systems based on the community's own voices. And so communities under food sovereignty, it's recognized that they have the right to decide what they eat, what they grow, and how they grow it. So if we turn to the story of Belo Horizonte, one of the reasons that it's such a really great example to analyze is that the city actually took an approach almost explicitly. If you look at the laws that were passed to create their programs, that really straddles the distance between the second and third framework. They really refer to a lot of ideas that would be compatible with food justice and with food sovereignty. And so one framework that I've come back to time and again has been called the 5 A's of food security. Is developed by Cecilia Rocha, who's one of my mentors, who's introduced me to Belo Horizonte and the first, at least North American researcher to write about Belo Horizonte's programs. And so she developed these 5 A's between 2003 and 2009. And interestingly, they're starting to be incorporated, particularly the agency element, which she introduced with respect to food security, starting to be incorporated in larger discourse. But availability, again, it has to be there. It is a prerequisite. The issue is that it is almost always there in contemporary cases. So it is not that it's not a factor, it's just that in most cases, it is not the chief problem. Accessibility, effective distribution. So do you have the money, the rights, the infrastructure that allow you to get to food or food to get to you when it is available? Acceptability, so is it culturally appropriate and nutritionally adequate? So if you keep halal or kosher, vegetarian, vegan, are you able to get food that matches your culture, your specific needs, and actually nourishes you adequately? Adequacy, which is where she put both food safety and ecological sustainability. And then agency. So one could think of this a lot of different ways. The ability and effectiveness of the people to gather together and demand their rights or create their rights, and the existence of those rights themselves. And what Rocha has said for years is that we cannot achieve the first 4 A's of food security without agency. So it is, in many places, the least recognized, but arguably the most fundamental to sustained food security. And if you look at the laws in Belo Horizonte, they don't use the exact same words, but it's very similar words in the laws that set out their programs in 1993. And so looking at Belo Horizonte through the lens of these 5 A's will be most of the rest of this talk. This is a drawing from my first book on the programs of Belo Horizonte based on my PhD work at Michigan with John Vandermeer and Yvette Perfecto, among others. And so if we look at Belo Horizonte 1992, 1993, right when the programs were starting or before they started. And the research the city had on hand showed that around 40% of families were below the poverty line, and about 20% of children under the age of 3 had some degree of malnutrition. They saw as well there's a general nutritional imbalance, not enough protein consumption, and not enough vitamins and micronutrients, fruits and vegetables in diets. And that was the context. So if you watch the video, that was the context that Patrícia Ananias de Souza, the mayor who started the programs, came into in the 1990s. And over the past 30 years now, actually, you've seen a significant change in Belo Horizonte, started by Patrícia Ananias in 1993. So the programs of Belo Horizonte's SMASAN, I didn't explain what SMASAN is. So the name has changed many times, but SMASAN stands for the Municipal Secretariat of Food and Nutrition Security. And this was founded as a new government office in 1993. It directly serves around 800,000 of the approximately 2.5 million in Belo Horizonte every year, and includes about 20 programs. This includes school meals and education programs where they serve about 200,000 school meals every day, fresh cooked, a large percentage locally sourced. They have organic produce fairs. They have a program called Straight from the Countryside where they buy directly from farmers, bring them in. They're able to rent a produce stall in major traffic thoroughfares for the equivalent of about $40 a year. And depending on the year, between 10 and 40 farmers participate in that. So it's never been a huge program, but I've always viewed it as an important proof of concept and a great potential to scale up. And they estimate it's about 550 tons of food distributed through those programs to about 53,000 families a year. They also have assistance programs for at-risk populations in terms of having meals provided, fresh cooked meals again provided, or other assistance for daycares, homeless shelters, retirement homes, as well as running urban gardens, school gardens, and adult cooking and nutrition education programs. They also have an agroecology certificate training program now, which is a recent addition. And this is all on an annual budget. 10 years ago, that was less than $40 million a year. I haven't converted that for inflation, but less than 2% of the city budget. And this is a little bit more up-to-date numbers. Those numbers were from, like I say, 2013 or so. You can go here to actually look at a whole booklet that the city of Belo Horizonte developed, just talking about their programs and going over the results. But you can see here some of them from 2019, including 20,000 people trained through those education programs on cooking, agroecology, things like that, that allow them to then go get relevant jobs. So another important thing about this program, there's a lot of innovations that happen and for a variety of reasons end up being temporary. But these programs have lasted now about 30 years through 9 mayoral terms of 7 different mayors, which is a kind of astounding accomplishment. Even I'm surprised. Every time a new mayor comes in, I'm still surprised because they've also had about 4 or 5 different political parties come in, and these programs have ended up being maintained. Challenging times sometimes, but they still are going strong, it seems. So in terms of the results from SMASAN's programs, between 86 and 96, there's about a 25% increase in consumption of green vegetables. It went from the 6th highest consumption of major Brazilian cities to the 1st highest. Went from the 8th to the 2nd highest in consumption of fruits. And in that specific period, at least, only one other major Brazilian city saw a consumption increase in vegetables and fruits at all. If we look at measures of hunger, and of course, regrettably, as a researcher, there's often actually not the best numbers available. But I was able to find some of the numbers to look at, okay, what can we say objectively, heavy quotes, happen as a result of the programs. And we can see that infant hospitalization due to malnutrition dropped 60% compared to not when the program started, but the first recorded data point in 1998. Infant and under 5 mortality dropped by 70% and 60% respectively. And these are numbers actually that Cecilia also reported on. But I think in my book, I was the first to actually look at the numbers and find that there was a 1/3 decrease in citywide hospitalization due to diabetes in that time period. I can't prove a straight line link from the programs to these results. Brazil as a whole also saw decreases in infant malnutrition in that time. But given all the programs they have, given what they've spent on it, and given the fact that their decreases in infant malnutrition and mortality started before Brazil's, I think that there's, or at least their increase was more rapidly, I should say, more rapid than Brazil as a whole. I think we can point to those programs as having a significant effect. So the original question that I went in for my PhD research was, how and why does SMASAN work? How do they get these results? And I had 3 questions: how the programs come to be, and how they've achieved what they've achieved. Did that affect the practices of local farmers that partner with the city in terms of that Straight from the Countryside program? And those farmers were located in the Atlantic rainforest of Brazil, which is a biodiversity hotspot. I can't remember the exact number, but it's something like in 1 hectare of Atlantic rainforest, they found over 300 species of trees or something just ridiculous. And has influenced biodiversity via these farmer practices. If farmers are practicing more agroecologically, is that improving biodiversity results. I'm really only going to focus on this first question today. Both my book and this journal article goes more into depth on the other questions of farmer practices and biodiversity. There seemed to be a positive effect on both. But if we step back then and ask these questions of why was Belo Horizonte was and is seemingly as successful as it is. And I should note one of the things that most impresses me about Belo Horizonte is, and all the times I've talked to them, they do not call their programs a success because there is still hunger. Like we still have work to do. So it's not yet a success, but where they've made advances, how can we understand why those advances happened? And if we look at all 5 A's, so availability, Brazil, Belo Horizonte, the amount of food available is not the problem, but they did recognize that they wanted to support local production specifically. And so they had the Straight from the Countryside program, as well as other programs where they try to connect small and local farmers to regional and national markets within Belo Horizonte, but also within the larger region. And so that's promotion of production from small farms is one of the specific goals of their original law. And an aside here that I probably don't actually have time for, but it's important to me, is the governor of Michigan, Governor Whitmer, recently identified as one of her goals making sure that food, was still available at low prices. And there is a problem and a paradox here. Most agricultural products in the United States are sold below the cost of production, or at least most commodities. About 7 of 8 commodities are sold below the cost of production. That means the farmer is losing money overall on producing and selling of food. And so counterintuitively, actually, economists have started to find that higher food prices, which long were thought to hurt everyone, including farmers, because they still, even farmers buy a portion of their food. But there seems to be evidence that higher food prices actually lower global poverty in the long run. And the long run for economists apparently is 6 months to 2 years, I believe. And what they found was that there was definitely a period where hunger increased. And we saw this in the 2008 price spike. There was a global food price spike in 2008, 2009. And they found, of course, that there was lower food security immediately after. But in 6 months to a 2 year period, in a panel of about 30 countries in the majority world, they found that actually farmers received a significant part of those higher prices. And that actually decreased rural poverty. It also decreased urban poverty because this was a large enough effect that it paid more to be a farm laborer. And so now people in the city had to pay more if they wanted laborers to leave the farm or stay in the city because it paid more now to be a farmer or a farm laborer. And so they found a net improvement in poverty from higher food prices. Now, this is very different, for example, in a context like the United States. My friend Eric Holt-Jimenez had pointed out, less than 2% of United States people are farmers. And so you wouldn't expect this kind of redistribution to happen, but we do have quite a lot of people in food-related industries, food and food service, food production, food processing, food retail. And so I think there's a really big and important opportunity to think about how to connect fair prices for farmers, prices above the cost of production, which, as far as I know, every economic model would say you should have, with fair wages. So people being able to afford enough to pay fair prices to farmers. So it's a bit of a side. It's not necessarily the way Belo Horizonte has approached it, but I think an important element when we're talking about availability of food and food production. Aside over, going back to SMOS on the 5 A's. So accessibility, the second A, and this is something that SMOS and Belo Horizonte addressed through a variety of programs, including some of which were mentioned in the reading response, fixed and low price produce markets where everything is sold at the time of the research, I think it was about 20 cents a kilo, because everything in the store was the same price. It encouraged people to mix and match and improve their dietary diversity. And those prices also were calculated to be above the cost of production. So despite what I was just saying, it not being Belo Horizonte's chief concern in terms of food prices being higher, they did try to make their programs come in above the price of production. So people are not losing money even when they take part in these programs. So there's the Bastacers, which are the one of the produce shops that are part of this program. They're also called sacalões, which means great big bag, because the same price for every produce item, you can just put it all in one great big bag. You don't have to separate it out. There's also the People's Restaurants, which serve around 15,000 low-cost cafeteria meals every day. Cafeterias are a big thing in Brazil. It's excellent food. Doctors, lawyers, people, children who are sleeping on the street. You have every kind of people coming to the People's Restaurants. And they do have emergency food aid. Belo Horizonte's idea is food with dignity. And so they don't want to directly have to provide food to people, not because they're against people having food, but they want to make sure everything else works so people don't need to have food aid. But they recognize there is a need, so they also have emergency food aid programs. In terms of acceptability, this is something else that was woven into all their programs in interesting ways. So, for example, at the school meals, at the popular restaurants, the People's Restaurants, the meals are designed by nutritionists and cooks together. They used to have a recipe contest for the best recipe reflecting local culture. Minas Gerais, the state where Belo Horizonte is considered sort of the home of down-home cooking. So if you think about, I don't know, soul food or other food cultures in the United States, Minas Gerais is sort of the state that's one of the states known for having that deep, long food culture. Uh, Purity and safety standards are part of acceptability. SMASAN monitors those across the city for all restaurants, food outlets, and educational programs so that students, adults, everyone knows and has nutritional information that they're able to act on. And as I mentioned, the People's Restaurants, which uh, look at uh, look at this acceptability as well through the recipe contest, through making sure the meals are balanced, through making sure that there are vegetarian and vegan options available as well as meat. They serve around 12,000 meals per day, 248 days a year. In terms of adequacy, as I mentioned, SMASAN has oversight over food safety for all food vendors in the city. They also, so adequacy had two parts, food safety and sustainability. In terms of sustainability or practices that use agroecology that are more in line with the more than human environment and support it rather than detract from it. That's been something that's been inconsistent in SMASAN over the years, but more recently, like I said, they have an agroecology certification school and reference center, which they've been working on for years, and their outreach staff that go to check the farmers that are selling to the city to make sure they're meeting standards. Many of the times, those advisors would support agroecology and help farmers get access to agroecology information and education. Oops. Okay. And then there's possibly higher biodiversity on local farms. Um, Again, you can look at this journal article I wrote looking at it. I call it exploratory. It was a small sample size. It was only looking at ant biodiversity, which can't stand in for all biodiversity, but is an interesting sort of first indicator. It looked like farms that worked with SMASAN did seem to have higher biodiversity and more similarity to rainforest species on their farms than farms that didn't work with Belo Horizonte. So we come to poll 3. I've got 13 slides left in 8 minutes. So let's see how we do. So 50 seconds, which we probably will need because these answers are rather long. So we'll give this 50 seconds. Oh, okay. Very interesting. So over half the people said the government should use multiple means to ensure everyone has enough access to food. So, I mean, I would say there is not one right answer, but if you had to ask me what it would mean, I would agree with 55% of folks. Um, though the redistributing is interesting, that's the second place. So that's definitely also an important element of food sovereignty and other traditions in terms of really questioning the state as well and allowing people to not just manage their own food system, but to grow their own food. So thank you, everyone. That is very interesting. Um, Basically, no country that I know of considers the right to food to mean the government must buy and distribute food to those who need it. But that is actually what the United States has said its fear is. It has resisted consistently for the past 50, 60 years the idea of a right to food, which is part of the International Covenant on Economic, Cultural, and Social Rights, which most countries in the world have ratified, but the United States has not. And so the attitude of the United States has generally been pursuing economic growth, or that's an aspiration but not an obligation. But if we look at Belo Horizonte and we remember Cecilia's admonition that we cannot achieve food security without agency, Belo Horizonte looked at food as a right of citizenship. It took actually in 1993, it basically took the idea of the right to food, which was the right to food and food security were sort of brand new terms in 1993. And the first secretary in charge of SMASAN was a nutrition economist, Maria Higina Nubuku. And she said that she really wanted to treat it as a right of citizenship of the city before the country, before a lot of places have really thought about that. The other element of both agency and the way Belo Horizonte approached this is not just a static right, it is part of procedural justice. So justice sometimes is broken down into distributive and procedural. Distributive meaning who gets access to what, how do we distribute what we have, and procedural meaning who gets to decide who gets what, how we decide on disputes, how we resolve conflicts. And Belo Horizonte really embraced, to a significant part, both of those, partly through their food policy council as being a key venue for affecting food policy in the city. And so what they saw is that government should be a partner and guarantor of the right to food, not a provider of it, not buying food for people. And they saw it through the lens, they would often say to me, through the lens of the right to free exercise of religion or free speech in the United States. That the United States does not have to, we don't provide people with churches, we don't build churches, we don't build a printing press, but rather if someone is not being able to access or exercise their religion, if they're not able to access a free press, if someone is stopping people from being able to, the government is stopping people to be able to say, speak freely, that the government has to step in and make sure everyone has access to those rights. And they said food security is the same. The government is not a provider or is a provider of last resort, but what it should be doing as first resort is governing society, partnering with people to make sure that everyone has access through a variety of means. And going back to that procedural justice element, there's a lot of specific interesting things in Brazil. Brazilian constitution requires consultation with civil society on major initiatives. It doesn't define what that looks like, but things like food policy councils are something that have been instituted in a lot of places, and councils of other infrastructure and other rights in order to consult with civil society, with people outside of government on how to actually provide these rights. There's also participatory budgeting, which is, I don't have time to go into, but is a way that people can organize all the way down to the individual street level to decide on how money is spent in a city or a region. And besides the moral commitment to these things, participatory and deliberative spaces are also important for legitimacy and efficacy, by which I mean people are more likely to participate and obey a process and rules and programs that they're part of designing. And many people argue that it is more effective to have deep democracy because you're able to hear from people directly what their problems, their needs, their abilities, and their wisdoms are. So those are sort of all the reasons and inputs into agency. And then focusing on Belo Horizonte's success in particular, I'd say the two keys are that they had this comprehensive, holistic approach, all 5 of the 5 A's, rooted in human rights, rooted in the idea of food with dignity. They helped influence a national constitutional right to food in Brazil, which was repealed under previous presidents. Remains to be seen to me if they will reissue it. And actually, I have not kept up with Brazil since Lula's been reelected. I don't think they've repassed it, but that's possible. And the other key to Belo Horizonte's success is a deep basis in participatory democratic ideals, despite the fact that it's been inconsistent. So the food policy councils at times have not been supported or not met. But under the past 2 mayors, not only have they been sort of revivified, including a council on school meals, which specifically addresses that program, but the previous mayor put the citizen councils into the org chart, which I thought was a really nice, at least symbolic step that we are reporting not just to the government official, we are reporting to our fellow residents and citizens. So starting to wrap up, the lessons on this long road and the start to ending hunger. And one of the things I think is interesting and important to note is the food programs of Belo Horizonte, a lot of them extrapolate or build on ideas that came all the way from José de Castro, who was a Brazilian anthropologist who wrote a book called The Geography of Hunger in 1932. And he argued back in 32 that hunger was not the result of workers being lazy, workers being inefficient, workers being ignorant. He said, no, the problem with hunger is that their conditions of life, the type of housing, the salaries that they have. Um, he also was a big supporter of small scale and subsistence agricultures. He argued that this is the only form of agriculture that is dedicated expressly to feeding people and for human needs, not for trade, not for money, but for feeding people in their community. But he developed a precursor to school meal programs, the popular restaurants. His programs were embraced at the time by Getúlio Vargas. And Getúlio Vargas was a dictator, then popular elected president, then dictator again, complicated legacy. But he put into place a lot of programs by Castro and put Castro as a member of government. After the military dictatorship actually ousted Vargas, and I think he committed suicide in office. The dictatorship rolled back almost all the programs of Castro, and he actually ended up in exile abroad for the rest of his life. But so then we see 1932, 1940s, de Castro and Vargas putting some programs in place, then being torn up through the dictatorships that lasted from the 60s into the 1980s. And then we come to Zero Hunger, which was founded in 2003 as a program during former and current President Lula's first term. The late historian Angus Wright argued that the various redistributive programs of Lula and then Dilma Rousseff, who was president after him, including but not only Zero Hunger and what's called the Family Scholarship, which is basically a cash redistribution, giving people below the poverty line a certain amount of money to buy food, along with increased minimum wage and nearly full employment. He argued it led to really one of the great reductions in poverty anywhere. Of course, there are many stories, there are many analyses. My former postdoc, Johan Oldekop, and his student, Cecily Dingeland, actually found, looking at FOMI Zero, they found very limited impacts on poverty when they looked at multidimensional poverty reductions. They did find, unsurprisingly to us maybe, increases in food production were not necessarily the leading to improvements in food security or health. And what they found was most effective, because it was effective in some places, it was most effective when there was associated investment in other functioning institutions. So this goes back to Cormac-O'Grada and good governance. It goes back to the results from Smith and Haddad, the importance of health infrastructure, of sanitation, of water, of other human rights. So why do we have Castro and Vargas launching these programs that were doing really good things and then going away and then happening again under Lula and then disappearing again under Temer and Bolsonaro and then coming back again? Like if we've solved the problem, why don't we just stick with the thing that works? Whether we're right or left, why don't we just keep working, keep what works? And a key insight for me, and I try to wrap up soon, is just often we think either implicitly or explicitly of the way policy is made as some kind of a linear process, or maybe a linear process with some feedback loops. You look at the issue, you think about how to solve it, you implement the best idea with some compromise, you see if that works. Or another way of looking at linear policy formation, but the same idea that you start with a problem, you figure out how to fix it, you try something, you see if that's something that was successful, rinse and repeat. As the political scientist Paul Kearney has said, political scientists largely don't use this model anymore because this model doesn't actually describe how policy systems work. Unfortunately for us, there is no alternative model that is equally simple. The real world, who knew, turns out to be a little bit more complicated. And there's actually a lot of debate as to what model should replace this, or if any one model can. I like a model called multiple stream analysis, and with skipping the long and just going straight to the short, the basic idea of multiple stream analysis is that different actors that influence policy actually are sort of doing their own thing, that politicians and people who administer programs at USDA and Department of Health and all those places are sort of in their own space, talking to their own people. And sure, they talk to voters, they talk to social movements, they talk to academics, but they're mostly doing their own thing. You have social movements and civil society identifying its problems and its priorities, and they're sort of doing their own thing, again, influenced by others, but within themselves, largely determining what they're focusing on. And then academics and policy specialists who care about these issues are often their own stream doing things. And the multiple stream analysis says, in short, when these three groups come together, when these streams join, that's when you're most likely to get significant change in policy, hopefully for the better, is when these come together. And it doesn't guarantee it, but it makes it much more likely. And I really feel like this model applies very well to what we saw in Belo Horizonte and saw in Brazil in general. If you think about Belo Horizonte, actually was just one of a whole series of programs, participatory budgeting, sustainable agriculture, support for small family farms, education reforms, a lot of programs that came out of social movements in the 60s and 70s uh, when people were organizing and protesting against the military dictatorship of the time. And you saw something like 7,000 local communities in the 1990s protesting the dictatorship. You had millions of people participating in movements, including the Citizens Action Movement Against Hunger and Poverty and For Life, a very catchy name, I know, which was headed by this gentleman, Herbert de Souza, Brazilian sociologist. And there was a whole variety of things that were proposed, and there actually were 12 million signatures in support of civil society developed amendments that were developed with neighborhood associations, trade unions, and political parties. That as the dictatorship came to an end, these amendments were submitted to the National Constitutional Assembly, and many, not all, were incorporated, and then many more were followed up upon by subsequent administrations or individual mayors or other policy figures like Patrice Ananias de Souza, who is here, former and current President Lula, and Maria Regina Nabuco, who was the first head of SMASAN. And so I argue you had basically academics, policy thinkers, policy makers, and civil society coming together, and that is why you had this flourishing of a lot of ideas in the 1990s and 2000s in Brazil that really, I think, pushed democracy and social service to a whole new sort of stage of realization. Um, and even as things have been set back, Graziano da Silva, the former Secretary General of the FAO, as well as actually the former head of Zero Hunger, said that we've had setbacks, but if it's been done before, it can be done again. And that's because of this messy process. It's not linear, but I love this expression that's said amongst some movements: no permanent victories, no permanent defeats. So quickly wrapping up, one of the things that is important to me about those social movements is not just that the social movements and academics and others came together. It's that if you were Lula, if you were Patrice Ananias de Souza, if you were Herbert de Souza, when you were advocating for these things with civil society in the streets, Herbert de Souza was constantly under threat of being jailed and exile. Castro actually lived long enough to be alive in these times and died in exile. Uh, Dilma Rousseff, the former president, and her husband were probably tortured as part of the dictatorship. These were not just people and these were people who were trained as lawyers, as academics, as journalists. So these were not just people who wrote articles in support of social movements. These were people who were putting it on the line. And I argue that's vitally important because a really strong human motivator is reciprocity. That is, we tend to help people that we believe are also, or help people or help situations when we believe others are helping. There's actually a really interesting finding in terms of altruism, of helping without expectation of reward. And humans do that, but we do that when we have a reasonable expectation that other people around us are also doing it. Basically, we will work towards a common good, even at sacrifice to ourselves, if we believe that we're part of others working for a common good. And so in organizing and movement building and outreach, I think we really have to ask, especially those of us like myself placed in academia, what are we doing? What are we sacrificing? What are we changing? How are we addressing our priorities to make sure that we are in participation and dialogue and addressing the changes and priorities and actions that are called for by our communities, that are pointed to by their wisdom, and that reflect the ask that we're making from our research, that people need to cut down on this or change this. What are we doing to also do our part of what we're asking of others? And so just, I think from Belo Horizonte, the first presentation I gave about this work after I published my book was at Shaw University, which is where Ella Baker and others started the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, a really important civil rights organization, incredibly important. And both Belo Horizonte and the movements and activism around that, and people like Ella Baker, uh, people like Fannie Lou Hamer, I think there's a number of things that they taught us. The importance, for one thing, of shared and ongoing analysis, so that bringing the streams together, not staying in your silo, but talking to those others, so you actually can advocate together, coordinating and cross connection along mass mobilization. There's been some really good pieces in the past about 10 years on protests, and arguing that protests have become the goal for some folks. But protests are a tool, they're an important tool, but they're a tool to be put into a larger agenda. So how do we think of this larger agenda and what tools we want to use? How do we work between those of us who have more privilege and those of people who, their life, their livelihood is on the line? How do we really live that reciprocity? And a really basic finding that if you're able to find ways to work together continuously, that is just much more effective than working together once, than just participating in one activity. And there's challenges to that, I know, but there's many reasons from multiple fields that working together continuously, building trust, building something is so much more effective. And then effective solidarity with the most marginalized, which to me begins with listening and being present. So I had one paper that, one presentation that I called Food Sovereignty is Showing Up. To me, just being in spaces where you are invited or welcome of communities that are doing the work, being there, listening, saying, how can I help, based on what they need, not based on what you want to give, is really important. And then we need to then create and maintain and expand spaces where we're building power together, whether that's within governance structures, which I think is possible, or within our communities, or preferably both. And these are just some resources, organizations that talk about, I think, some really similar important ideas that we can see, particularly right now in the Black farming, Black food sovereignty movement, but also Ella Baker going back to civil rights movement, going back to Fannie Lou Hamer. Monica White's book, Freedom Farmers, goes through a lot of this. My former organization, SAFON, I think, echoes a lot of the principles talking about here. So these are some examples to follow up on or think about. So finally got there. Conclusion, I like to end with a couple of quotes. One from Park Troutman, who he said, thinking about local food years ago, that he feels like people look at a problem and they say, what can I do? And the problem with that is they tend to say, okay, I should do something similar to what I'm already doing. But they really just keep in the same vein, maybe a little bit different. But what you actually have to do is start with what is needed to actually achieve my goals, to change the world, to change and work with my community, and work backwards then on how I can contribute to what is needed. Paulo Freire, the pretty famous Brazilian radical educator, a real humanist can be identified more by his trust in the people, which engages him in their struggle, than by 1,000 actions in their favor without that trust. And from an Aboriginal activist group in Australia, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting our time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. So with that, I'll say thank you, and we have time for questions.
Thanks, Jahi. That was phenomenal. So phenomenal. Wow. And we have a series of questions that we want to jump right into, given we have limited time for our rich Q&A. So I'm going to start immediately. Is that okay? Are you ready?
Let's do it.
All right. What do you think of the lack of neighborhood grocery stores where you can shop for healthier foods?
I mean, I'm not sure what part of my opinion is being looked for, but I mean, I think it's a problem. I think a key part of that, to me, I mean, there's a lot of factors. I mean, the way redlining and urban renewal and growth has happened, the subsidies given to big box stores, the fact that you can get more profits from people who have more money, and the fact that if we just concentrate it into one big box and have people drive there, that's probably more profitable than having neighborhood stores. All those are problems. And I think that they come from, again, there's another question I saw somewhere about corporate influence, but systems that are designed to benefit capital, benefit profit, and not benefit communities and people, and finding ways to avoid, suppress, and not listen to community voices. Alongside all that, I think there's also just the fact that, like I say, when you start with a food system where you're selling most of the stuff below the cost of production, it's going to be really hard for everyone else to survive, from food hubs to grocery stores, because they are not able to charge what it takes to actually produce and maintain those stores. And they're not able to charge what it takes because people are not paid enough. So I think it all connects together.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. The whole series, the whole discussion around food swamps, food deserts, food apartheid, food oasis. I mean, all the terms that talk about the various reasons and the various solutions are very very intertwined, but also very easily dissected. Yeah, I appreciate that response. So our second question is from Sydney, and they are illuminating or emphasizing what you shared in terms of the reasons why hunger had decreased, right, over time, and they were in order of frequency or order of effectiveness or impact. So she says, can you elaborate on how the increased female schooling influenced the prevalence of food security? Is it from economic mobility?
So there's multiple lines of influence there, and so it's one of the things. Gender equality. I don't want to be flippant because it's a wildly serious subject, but gender equality in some ways is kind of a Swiss Army knife of helping out communities. That there's multiple ways that everyone is helped if women and femmes are lifted up and have just true equality. There's multiple ways that's channeled into everyone being better off. So economic mobility is one aspect. It's one that's most heavily emphasized often by economists. It plays into it, but there's also just basically autonomy and sovereignty, which is not tied to economic mobility in some ways, but just people women in particular being able to have more power and control over their own life course, deciding how their household is going to work, having more equal negotiation position with male partners. Also, when you have higher gender equality in education in particular, women grow. There's debate on if it's a majority of the world's food, but a significant portion of the world's food. When they have more equal access to resources, including education, their production is even more productive, and they tend to grow things that are more focused on community and family life than markets, and so that helps food security. And there's also just the element of Ann Larimore, who is a professor emerita at University of Michigan in women's studies, always, always, always pointed out when we talk about population growth and how do we feed the future population, if we assume the population is going to keep growing, we are assuming continued repression of women, because a large part of the population growth is women having more children than they would freely choose if they had full equality. And so population growth, I would say, is not the source of most of our problems, but insofar as it is part of it and has some part of food security, when women have more control over their own bodies, have the appropriate control over their own bodies, you see a lot of other good effects on society. Of course, it's important for its own sake. I never want it to be instrumentalized, but it does also have positive effects besides the fact that women having the rights that they should have because they should have it.
Right, right. And I appreciated that list, and I actually thought this was the number one reason. And so it reminds me of what Raj Patel says around ending hunger, which he's excited,
Yeah.
and and the intersection with feminism and women empowerment. Like, we can't address one without the other. So thank you for reaffirming that. So the next question is from an anonymous attendee. What do you think is so fearsome about a right to food to the US government?
Hmm. I mean, I guess the short answer, maybe, the short answer is it really threatens the dominant model. I mean, amongst both our political parties, though I'd say one is noticeably, but better than the others. But both of them, if you look at the founding of the Food and Agriculture Organization, the United Nations, they were explicitly told that food security and ending hunger could not be more important than trade. And this has happened time and time again. The United States, I think that there are people who are really just working to maintain the corporations. The business of America is business is a famous quote. Um, and so I think there is very cynical avoidance of the right to food because they don't want to interfere with the fact that trade in food is immensely profitable, and feeding people is not always profitable. We're helping people feed themselves. But I also think there are true believers who, believe that the best way to get to food security is trade and economic growth. And so we shouldn't confine ourselves to rights. We should have rights as a result of people having more rights to be capitalists, essentially. So, I mean, I think that's incorrect, but I want to acknowledge that there are people who oppose the right to food, not just for cynical reasons. But I think that's the manufactured consent, to use Noam Chomsky's term, the manufactured consent of, okay, business and trade has to be the top so we can stay on top in terms of our own power and grow the economy, and eventually that'll trickle down.
Right, for sure. Trickle down economics works for no one but the top 1 to 3%, as we say. All right, the next question is from Jonathan. What are some ways you would suggest applying Horizonte's model to more rural areas with smaller populations and economies?
Oh, that's a good one. I have not gotten that one before. Um, I would say the zero hunger programs in Brazil, uh, those extended beyond the cities. And so one of the things that they had in a bunch of municipalities, including rural ones, is still local procurement. Um, there are still, urban centers or downtowns and rural areas. There are schools that still need to feed their students. And so that requires infrastructure, that requires certain kinds of investment, but buying locally and supporting local procurement is one element that Brazil's already applied across the country, buying from family farmers. Additionally, the Zero Hunger program had that redistribution program I was talking about, the Bolsa Familia, where people below a certain poverty line were given what's called a direct transfer, given money to spend on what they needed. There's been a lot of research actually over the past 2 decades on conditional and unconditional cash transfers. So conditional is you've got to show up for work or keep your kids in school. Unconditional is you're below a certain income, here's some money. And even traditional economists are finding that both of those are very effective. And in many cases, unconditional is more effective. And so that's something that can apply to any area and allow people to purchase their own food or means of production, more readily. And I think there's just a lot of general rural revitalization in terms of investing in infrastructure, investing in schools, investing in livable communities, and working with different folks, because there's a lot of different tensions and histories in rural areas, but working with different folks to really just invest in their lifeways. There's a lot of great stuff happening that is undersupported by industry, by governments, by foundations. And so there's a lot to explore and a lot of creativity there. I definitely learned that from my time at Saffon, that there's a lot of people who have solutions for their communities that need more of that attention, need more of that voice. And so uh, I couldn't presume to say a lot of the details, but I know there's a lot of people who have a lot of things they're doing already or could do, given the resources and power.
Right, right. And speaking of Saffron, one of the things that I learned as well with that particular community is how the rural and urban solidarity is really important for food sovereignty, right? Like we can't negate one for the other, but bringing them back into a symbiotic relationship where they're reinforcing the strengths and power of one another is really important.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. So that I would say is something that you saw some of in Belo Horizonte that it could be developed better, but 100% agree. And thanks, Shakira.
Yeah, I gotta illuminate our past and current intersections.
Right. That's right.
So two more questions. What are the most surprising barriers to the three streams that you mentioned coming together?
Hmm. I mean, to be honest, one of the most surprising ones to me is, I don't know if you characterize it as fear or comfort amongst academics. Um, that, one of the things I said about like being in spaces and listening is something a lot of academics or even just students find hard. I mean, I don't know if any of you were present for this. Actually, it was like 9 years ago, so probably not. But there was a food sovereignty summit at University of Michigan, and that I was part of, and some students they did it. They brought some partners from Detroit. We had, I think, Malik spoke at that. Some other folks came in, and people were saying, well, Malik in his talk said, Malik Akini said, well, if you want to help, you can come and help us weed. And some students said, well, when do I get a chance to give my input? And it's just sort of boggled my mind because I'm like, you're not from there. You have every right to give your input, but you don't want to give your input. You want them to follow your input. And you have no right for anyone to follow your input, especially if you're coming just with, book learning. And you're not to say your book learning is wrong, but I think there's a really key element of listening and learning and kind of earning your place to be part of a community and listened to. And so anyway, I think just the academic lack of humility and comfort and pressures, because we're not rewarded for anything that actually helps communities by and large. When I was finishing my dissertation, I was thinking I could write something that would give Belo Horizonte folks sort of some tips on what I saw in their programs, or I could write a book that engages with a lot of theory and sort of generalizes it. And only one of those would get you a PhD. And so that's been one of the barriers to me. And I think just also, like I say, a reluctance or a comfort or pressures. I also, there's a lot of sides to it. There's also pressures. But another time I was at U of M, people were complaining about, well, we had a climate march and we didn't have that many people turn out, and especially from Detroit. And this was whatever number of years ago. It was near the beginning of Black Lives Matter. And I said, well, how many of you have gone to a Black Lives Matter march? Because this is people dying today. We're talking about climate change where people are also dying today, but it's a bit more abstract. If you're not showing up for people who are dying today, why would you expect them to show up for an issue that is a little bit more abstract, a little bit out in the future? Like, we got to both be there for each other. And so that part surprises me, how many people, policy specialists or academics miss that part.
Right, right. Agreed. Well, thank you so much, Jahi. I think we're gonna end it there, given the time that we have, and that's a really beautiful way to end, let me say. And I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us and your like really phenomenal research. I can tell that you put a lot of energy and time into the work that you do. So please get his book, folks, if you haven't got his book, and please share more resources as they become available, Jahi. And we're going to pass it to Margot for some closing announcements. Thank you.
Thank you all. I really appreciate this opportunity. Thanks.